Gosh. Hi, Dave.
Who? Hi. Hanukkah. Sorry. I just have to be weird on the front end, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, you have to constantly make it look like I'm surprising you.
Yeah, and it's your fault.
Yeah. So I'm so sorry to surprise
I'm
you.
in a different place today. That's why we blurred it behind me. Yeah. I'm in Doug Glenn's house. So, and all the stuff on his wall is very inappropriate.
I
Anyway,
mean, people just can continue to wonder whether it's actually a white wall or your hair because it just like it kind of disappears at one point.
don't you love that? It's actually a halo.
No,
Oh, yeah, it is.
no. I'll make sure everyone knows there's no halo.
I think they know. I think they know. Okay.
Well,
Go
it's
ahead.
fun to be doing episode 11. Here we are again. We are talking about what in God's name is going on. That is the series that we are in. And the topic that we find ourselves in is around identity. We're exploring the biblical concepts of identity because identity is the driving force behind what we do, what we don't do, and why we do what we do and don't do. Did I do that right?
Boom. You nailed it.
Yes. Mic drop.
Mm-hmm.
But last week, or the last episode, we largely talked about the Israelites as they were standing on the banks of the Jordan River. And what they believed about themselves, they say, was that they were like grasshoppers. Well, at this stage in the game, they did not step into the Jordan, they did not cross over into the promised land. And it is because of what they believed about themselves, that they were like grasshoppers,
Mm-hmm.
because grasshoppers don't do that sort of thing. They don't even think about that sort of thing. They don't imagine that sort of risk and obedience. And so they did not enter into what God had for them.
Because of who they thought they were. Yep.
Right, right. So we've been talking about these thoughts, what we believe about ourselves, what God believes about us. And when we were done recording last week, you and I had a conversation, as we almost every time do. And then the next episode generally comes out of a question or a conversation that we have at the end while we're not recording. But we were talking about, so how big would the yes need to be to undo the effect of you having heard no your whole life?
Say that again. That's huge. Say that
It's
again.
huge. How big would the yes have to be to undo the effect of having heard no your whole life? So, no, you don't fit in. No, you don't matter. No, you don't have the right stuff. You're not welcome. You're not the right religion or race or gender. You don't have the right look. You don't follow the right customs. Insert whatever it is into that category of what you've been told no about your whole life. So, Dave, this stirs up a lot of things, both in me and I know in you. And you have a lot to say about this. So we're just going to let you take it from here.
Okay. Well, I love the question. You know, how big would the yes need to be if you've heard no? In part because the answer, in some ways, is obvious, and yet we don't know how to do it because it has to be a big one. I mean, the
Yeah.
yes you need to hear would have to be a big one to counteract a no you've heard your whole life. But I also love this question because it comes up so early in the story. And what I mean by that, this thing I'm doing today, it kind of dawned on me. At least 15. And part of this, just to set everyone up with where we're going on this one, is that the no we've heard so far that yeah, like we need to get over the negative feelings we have about ourselves because we think we're grasshoppers. This one isn't just about us, about all the ways we have heard no. It includes that, but this one, what I love about it, because of what Acts 15 is about, is that it's also about the ways that we have said no to other people. We being Christians, we're evangelical Christians, but the truth is, and this is kind of borne out in the text in the scriptures, it's usually religious people like us. Let's just be the bad guy in this little, who are often, it's often religious people, even in the text, who are often the quickest people to say, no, you don't fit. It's often religious people like us, who say, no, you don't belong. The answer is no, you're unclean. You're not good enough. You're not enough like us. But this thing in Acts 15, it all started in the context, again, of me going through the book of Acts, when in Acts 15, this great dissension and debate arose in a church in Antioch. And that's significant because this is 20 years after Pentecost, just to give some history. Antioch is a Gentile city, so there's Jews and Gentiles, so it's mixed. It's where we live. We live in Antioch in a way. It's not Jerusalem. Now, in Jerusalem, everybody didn't get along, but they all believed the Torah. They all read the Torah. They all went to synagogue. Everybody goes to church. We have the 10 Commandments in the square. In Antioch, not so much, okay? And so in Antioch, this great dissension arises, and the dissension actually was, it's actually, anyway, when I remember studying it and emotionally going, man, this is like, if I'm going to enter this story, I gotta feel how dangerous this is, because this is not just a division in the church. This division threatened to derail everything. The mission of the church, it threatened to undermine the message of the church, because they were and because they were distorting the message of the church, which was grace through faith and nothing else. I'll tell you and explain it in a second. And it's the first time historically, this is significant too, that in the existence of the early church, the greatest danger to the church was not outside. Okay, it wasn't Herod who was beheading James, and it wasn't Rome who was crucifying our people and we were being persecuted. This is Acts 15 is the first time, I think I'm right about this, that the greatest danger to the church was inside the church. Something's going on inside that's going to bring us down, which is, by the way, the scariest thing. I mean, and it's usually what I've seen, but this is kind of historically the first time. And it's something, by the way, that Paul saw and warned about in Acts chapter 20. I love the story. Acts chapter 20, he's saying goodbye to the Ephesian elders. Ephesus is the longest church, he stayed in any church. He was there for 3 years. He was apostolic. So he would start a church and leave, and then write these letters back to them. How are you doing? Kind of thing. Well, he's leaving Ephesus. He's saying these incredible things, and they're weeping and they're hugging each other and they really love each other. But at one point he says, he warns them and says, be aware that upon my departure, grievous wolves will come in from among you, not from outside. The grievous wolves will not be the Romans. They won't be the liberals. They won't be the gays. They won't be the bad guys we're all afraid of. The grievous wolves will come in from among you, not sparing the flock, because they're going to be pulling people into falsehoods about who they are and who God is, and heresies, if you will, about who God is and who they are and what they're worth. And so this thing about it being in the house, this is kind of historically the first time the danger was from within. And it's kind of like, we're all believers, let's at least love each other. Wait. No, sometimes you got to fight for some things and hang on to each other, but bring some stuff up, and they do. Here's what happened. Here's the context. Here's the story. Okay. 20 years after Pentecost, they've gone beyond Jerusalem. They were into Samaria. And I love this part too. They didn't go to Samaria in response to the Great Commission. Remember when Jesus said, go into all the world? I love this. And every one of them said, yes, we will. And 13 years later, they were still in Jerusalem. So it took a persecution for them to scatter, and they did. Another talk. Sorry.
They were busy packing, probably.
What's that? They were just
busy packing. Yeah.
No, they were like you and like me. They were afraid They stayed with what was familiar. I love it that it took so long, because that, I really care about those people. I'm never going to talk to them until something really upsetting sometimes has to happen for me to go, whoa, and then they were in Samaria, and that's a kind of a symbol of some things I've spoken of. But now they're in Antioch. Really, what's the word we use in America? Anyway, lots of different kinds of people are there, and but here's what's happening: more and more people are coming to faith. But in the eyes of some of the people who were coming to faith were the wrong kind of people. Well, I'm glad they came to faith, but they got to clean this thing up. They're not like us, say. So I'm not sure I accept them, because Antioch was, as I said, a Gentile city, not a Jewish city, which let Jewish mean like us, like they weren't a Christian place. They didn't like the Ten Commandments being in the public square. They weren't like us. And getting back to Gentiles were unclean. That we kind of know the story about that. They were unholy. They were unwelcome. They didn't fit. They were outsiders. So the word outsiders. So the word to them their whole lives, at least from the Jews. I mean, they might not have cared about what the Jews thought of them, but the word from the Jews to the Gentiles was no. You don't fit, you don't belong. And it was a particularly strong no from Torah observant Jews in Jesus' day in Jerusalem, including, and this is where it gets dicey, some of the Torah observant Jews who had come to faith. So they're Christians. Okay. So now they're in the Jesus camp, but they're still holding this pretty strong no toward Gentiles. And there was a very specific group in Acts 15 who were of the tribe of the Pharisees, or they're part of the Pharisees. They had come to faith, authentic faith, come down to Judea in Acts 15:1, identified in verse 5 as being of the sect of the Pharisees who had believed. But when they got to Antioch, they began to preach and teach the brethren, meaning Gentiles who had been converted. My battery is low on my computer. I have to plug it in. Can you pause it? Or...
We're back. Computer is charging.
Yeah. I forgot to plug my computer in. Okay, and we're back. Anyway, and I think I know where we were. These Pharisaic people who had come to faith were now in Antioch, and they began to teach the brethren, Gentile believers, who had just come to faith, that faith and grace was not enough. And they began to teach that unless you're circumcised, and this is the Jewish custom, according to the custom of Moses, you can't be saved. And it's just a different way to say you're still an outsider. You don't fit in, you don't belong. So it's just a different way to say to people who are already believers, the answer is no. Because you don't fit into this external sign, this whole thing we do to prove that we're okay. So the answer is no. But here's the deal. This no is being given to Gentiles who had heard that their whole life. Now they're in faith and they're hearing it again. Okay. Okay, they were from Antioch in Syria. Again, they'd heard it their whole lives. And I think we generally know the story. Let me just remind you of the history here, that to Jews, I would say, to religious people, and I'm just being hard on us, like, let's let this into good Christian people like me and you. People like this were unclean. They just were, I'm glad you're saved, but I don't want to be around them. If you got close to one, you became unclean. If you were a Jewish boy, this is kind of history, and you married a Gentile girl, or if you were a Jewish girl and married a Gentile boy, the Jewish family would have a funeral for you, not a wedding reception. So you were dead to them. That's how big this was. Some, in expressing their contempt, went as far as to say that Gentiles had only been created by God to serve as fuel for the fires of hell. So that's kind of
Ouch.
sounds a little angry. Which brings us back to this question: how big would the yes need to be if you've heard that your whole life? If you've heard no your own life, and it also raises this theme that we're talking about. What in God's name is going on there, right?
Yeah.
God's name, they're protecting what they think is God's law when they come to them and say, unless you're circumcised, you don't fit in. Unless you follow the rules the way we follow the rules, you don't fit in, you don't belong. The answer is no, because they were immoral Gentiles. That's their perception. They were unorthodox. Well, that's for sure. They were outsiders. That's also true. Here's what's also true. They didn't know the scriptures, not the way we do. They didn't go to synagogue every Sunday the way we did when we grew up. They didn't know the liturgy. They didn't understand the traditions. They didn't look like us. They didn't talk like us. They didn't act like us. They just didn't fit, at least not the way they are. But if you get circumcised, if you buy into this thing, you'll become part of us. But it was almost always this external, let's say, symbol. I mean, circumcision had symbolic meaning, and this is not the point of this talk, but basically it's a pretty good example of an external thing that if you're willing to suffer that much pain, anyone can do. It doesn't require a change of the heart. All that aside, how big would your yes need to be, particularly if the no you were hearing didn't just come from the world out there, but how big would the yes need to be if the no you'd been hearing your whole life came from Jerusalem / religion / the church? If it came from them, how big would the yes need to be? How far? And then, now this is on us, how far might we need to go who've been giving the no and maybe not even knowing that maybe it's not my personal no. I never felt like that, but I'm part of a church that kind of conveys that message. So how big would how far would I need to be willing to go to try to communicate a yes to people who, from people like me, not me, but people like me, have given their whole life? How far would I have to go to convince someone who maybe from us heard nothing, but no? How far would we be willing to go to convince someone that God knows the heart? Acts 15:11 said that the God who knows the heart knows theirs. So it's all about the heart. It's not about whether we're circumcised or not, that there is no distinction. This is in Acts 15:2 as well. There's no distinction between us and them. How far would I have to go to convince them there's no distinction between us and them, us and you, because we all stand in need of this same grace, verse 12. So how far would you be willing to go? Would you be willing to get in the chariot of a eunuch? That's my fun little question. And that comes from a story. Told it before. I love this take on it. Acts chapter 8. Philip was part of the persecution in Jerusalem that got scattered. So he finds himself in Samaria, and he responds to the prompting of the Spirit when he's in Samaria, and he's kind of transported into Gaza. And he comes across this Ethiopian eunuch who is in a chariot, who was reading the prophet Isaiah on the way to Jerusalem to worship. So just put it together. He's in a Gentile area. The Ethiopian eunuch is a eunuch, which is
yeah.
It's and Philip is, we would call him a Christian, but that they didn't call him that then. He's a follower of Jesus, but he's a Torah observant Jew. And to a eunuch and to a Torah observant Jew, he'd have an opinion about whether it was okay to be a eunuch. It's not okay. He'd be unclean. And it was usually, eunuchs usually became eunuchs when they were part of a pagan cult, this cult, and they would eunuchize them. I don't know if that's a word. But
I mean, this is a PG podcast.
Like, the closest thing I've seen in scripture to being like transgender, like he has no, anyway, they're gone. Anyway, so I'll leave that alone for a while. They were like Gentiles in that they were unclean, unwelcome, not included. The answer to you is no. Indeed, if this Ethiopian eunuch gets to Jerusalem to worship, which is where he's going, the temple there will say no. I mean, it's weird that he's even going. He's got some courage to go because he already knows if he tries to get in, the answer will be no, you're not allowed in here. But God, who knows the heart, this is in verse 11 of Acts 15, knew this eunuch guy. And what he knew about this guy's heart was that he had an open one. He was open to God. You wouldn't know that by just seeing him as a eunuch. You'd not know about his heart. You wouldn't care about that, right? So he's reading the book of Isaiah, and he's going to church. Okay, if it was today, he's on his way to church. A church that is going to kick him out as soon as he gets there.
What a waste.
Yeah, I know. And again, I just love this because I can just be in this story myself, because while Philip might have had an opinion about the rightness or wrongness of being a eunuch, that's not what they talked about the rightness and wrongness. Okay, I'm going to get in trouble, but about being homosexuality, I got an opinion. About being transgender, right. I have an opinion. I have a theology, but that's not what they talked about. And it's not what mattered. In that moment in particular, what mattered was that Philip got in the chariot with this guy. And from the scriptures, he began to explain to him the way of Jesus, and the God who knows the heart knows yours, and that he can clean the heart by faith because God makes no distinction. No, I'm just reading verses in Acts 15 here. He doesn't like Jews more than Gentiles. Sorry, Jews. Whites more than blacks. Sorry, whites. Whatever. He doesn't like more than women. Sorry, men. He doesn't like straight more than gay. You can have an opinion about gay or no. He doesn't love them more than gay. He doesn't love Philip more than the eunuch. He loves them both. So how big would the yes need to be? How far might you need to go to convince someone who's heard nothing but no, that God says yes? Would you go to Gaza? Would you go that far? Would you get in the chariot with the eunuch? Would you go that far? How big would the yes need to be? How loud would the voice need to be? To undo the effect of having heard no your whole life. Well, I don't know for sure in a mathematically precise way how loud the voice would need to be, but in the text, Acts 15, you should go back and read it. I'm not actually going to unpack the whole thing here, but I'll give you the verses as you do, because the text leaves some hints as to how loud the voice needs to be in a hidden in plain sight sort of way, because it took the voice of Peter, that's where it starts, who stood up in verse 11 after these guys from Judea came and said they have to be circumcised or they don't fit. And immediately Peter stood up and said in verse 11 that we're all saved through grace. And then he said, this is what I know, that the God who knows the heart and has cleansed our heart by faith makes no distinction between a circumcised Jew like Philip and a eunuch who's from Ethiopia, because he's looking at the heart. But it took more than that. Okay, that's one voice, Peter's voice. But it took more than that, because when Peter was done with his voice saying they need to hear a yes, it says in verse 12 that the people kept silent and continued to listen when Barnabas stood up. So Peter stands up. Everybody's going, oh, I can't believe he said that. And then Barnabas stands up and says much the same thing, but it took more than that, because when Barnabas was done, people kept silent, continued to listen when Paul stood up. And he began to speak, and to the voice of Paul, the voice of James was added in verse 14, who borrows from the voice of Peter, saying that Simon Peter has just reminded us. This is basically what James said. Peter just reminded us how God first considered himself by taking outsiders like us. God took outsiders like us as a people for himself. So he stood up and said, that, comparing, recognizing that we are outsiders, why can't we accept them the way God accepted us? But it took more than that voice. So you got James, Barnabas, Paul, Peter, because it took the voice of Peter again, and James adding then to the voice of the prophets. It took the voice of the prophets, because both Peter and James referred to the prophets. Peter said this, that God who knows the heart knows yours. He's cleansed your heart by faith, makes no distinction between us and them, because we've all been saved by grace through faith. So how big would the yes need to be? How loud would the voice need to be to undo the effect of having heard no your whole life? Again, if the text is any clue, the yes needs to be a big one. And the voice needs to be a loud one, and there needs to be a lot of them. Because to the voice of Peter was added the voice of Paul. And to the voice of Paul took him the voice of Barnabas. And to the voice of Barnabas is added the voice of James. And James himself adds all of the voices of the prophets. And then there comes my voice, and here we are, your voice too, as we're doing this video, and we're saying God knows the heart, but we have puny voices. What is our voice? Doesn't mean anything unless my voice can be added to the voice of Peter and Paul and Barnabas and James and the prophets, and to the prophets all the apostles. And I agree with them, and so do you. So now my voice feels bigger, because it's not just my opinion. I'm adding my voice to other voices in the scriptures. And when those voices all agree, you got a big voice. A pretty loud voice. Maybe a kind of voice, when you hear all those voices, a kind of voice that gives you courage to use your voice. Because now we're one voice. And what the voice has been saying from days long ago, starting with the prophets, is in verse 16, this: I will return and rebuild the house of David, which has fallen into ruins, but from the wreckage I will rebuild it, so that all nations who seek the Lord, including every person among the outsiders, who are called by his name, this is the word of the Lord, thus saith the Lord. So to the other voices, what that means is, to all those other voices, you had the voice of God, thus saith the Lord. So now God's voice is added to the mix, who has been revealing these things from the very beginning. But the really good news is this, that everything there that the prophet Amos says will happen has happened. Because through the word of Christ, who is the son of David, he has rebuilt the house of David in order that Gentiles now becomes this metaphor of outsiders. So in order that the Gentiles, every person who's outside and been said no to, who seeks the Lord, will find the Lord, and from the Lord will hear, yes, you belong. So beyond the words of Peter and Paul and Barnabas and James and even all the prophets, we add not only the word of God, but the work of Christ, who has forever turned the no you've always heard into a yes you'll never forget and can never lose. Don't. Can't lose it. And then to the work of Christ, add the presence and power of the Holy Spirit, who, according to Paul in Galatians 4 verse 6, God has sent into our hearts. And when the Holy Spirit does in the human heart, what the Holy Spirit does in the human heart is to minister to the human spirit that we are sons and daughters of God. And finally, to the words of the apostles and the prophets, to the work of Christ and the presence of the Spirit, add now the voice of God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, because all of this, says James, quoting the prophet in Isaiah, in verse 18, because that this is the word of the Lord. And this, all of this is the word of the Lord, who has been revealing these things from days long ago. That God who knows the heart knows yours. Gentile, Jew, I don't care. And he can cleanse that heart if you believe in him. And he makes no distinction between us and them, because we are all being rescued by that same grace. And all I can say now, relative to how loud would the voice need to be, or how big would the yes need to be, it's not big enough. May the eyes of your heart be enlightened. When Paul bent his knee and said, I can't talk you into this. My voice isn't loud enough. The yes isn't strong enough. So I bend my knee to the Father, said Paul, that somehow supernaturally the eyes of your heart would be enlightened. Crap. That you might be able to know the love of God in here by the work of the Spirit in you. And that has the power to turn that no into a yes as well. Lots of moving parts. That's all I got. I'm taking a nap.
Well, you can't yet. We're not done.
Okay.
I feel like I have acquired your ADD, because my brain went about 20 different directions through that story that you brought us through, and I'm not even quite sure where to land, although so beautiful that we actually landed in the same place that we landed in our last episode at the end, which was, may the eyes of your heart be enlightened.
Because it needs to be natural, right?
Yeah. To me, I feel like this, I don't know if this will sound applicable to you, but I feel like I just went to Oprah's favorite things show, and she brings out her favorite things, and it's like, you get a car, and you get a car, and you get a car, and everybody gets a car. Like, everybody gets this everyone, no matter who you are, you have a seat here.
Yep.
You this is for you.
Yep.
And then at one point during your storytelling and this conversation, all of this started because we're talking about what in God's name is going on. And the confrontation for me is, well, what in God's name is going on inside of her? That I'm deciding who gets this and who gets that and who doesn't. And thanks for accepting Christ, but you still don't look right, and you still don't behave right, and you're still not, even though you signed on the dotted line. Yeah. And why do I think I get to make those decisions?
Yep. Well, and I think there's a humility in realizing, when you even said sign on the dotted line, I know what you mean by that, but the key text, the key verse is, God who knows the heart knows theirs. Mm-hmm. That you don't know if it's, I had somebody, a little kid, dear kid, asked me, can homosexuals go to heaven? And he was sure that behavior was the thing that would keep them out. Right. And you go to heaven or hell, it won't be based on that, because God knows the heart. That you don't. I mean, let's do it on your behavior. I don't pass. By the way, I don't pass. Right, because that is the one that is this. Well, let's go on yours then. Do you? Are you gonna? No. God who knows the heart, and that's our salvation, and it isn't like everything is okay in any of these arenas, but God does know the heart, and there are people like the eunuch who are reading the book Isaiah metaphorically. They're looking for life, and they're seeing it in God, and they're wanting to go to the place where people talk about God, and all too often, the experience of the eunuch is that, he couldn't even do anything. You can't put that back. Sorry. Yeah. Well, and my brain went to all the places. I mean, maybe not a surprise. I'm not a eunuch.
so I can't identify with a eunuch, but there are places in
Yeah.
my life where I have spiritually felt like a eunuch or emotionally, or there's lots of different ways. Even though I do look a part of, you know, I fit in a lot of different places, let's just say that. But there's a lot of places that I don't fit in too. And yeah, I just have a lot of questions.
Yeah, me
This
too.
episode.
Stirred up questions for me too. Like, are you going too far this way? Is this going to
Yeah.
sound soft? Because there are things that are really disturb me about what's going on in the world around sexuality. I mean, you and I have had
Right.
conversations about
So
things
many.
you get asked that I didn't get asked, and that bugs me. But anyway, so I don't know how to have conversations like this without doing it like this. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, stir the
Well,
pot.
we definitely stirred the pot. That is for sure. And I can't wait to see what um gets stirred up next. I think where I want to land at the very end here is just that I think this conversation and at the very beginning of where you started, like there is so much solace, and this is, I feel like, the starting place of how we unpack how to live in our world the way it is. I think there's so much conversation, like, it's never been like this before. Yeah, it has. It has. And it has always been this way.
Yeah.
And what a beautiful,
Yeah, right.
right? What a beautiful, this is what God has to say about it. You step into the chariot. You just
Yeah.
you walk it out.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Annika. I love the way you add that stuff, and I hear that from people a lot. The other thing I've already said, but I want to say it as we wrap it up. I
Yeah.
love this picture of Philip, who I'm pretty sure had an opinion. So,
Mhm.
in this talk, it's like, no, I'm not trying to pull you off of your theology about some issue, but that person, why don't we? He got in the chariot with him
Yeah.
because he noticed something about his heart, and we draw our lines, and it's like don't have any boundaries. No, have your opinions, but why aren't we in the chariot? Let's get in the chariot and not be afraid um, to do that. So that's a conversation. Hopefully, I mean, whoever's watching, if they're with somebody, has something to talk about and wonder about, yeah. So
Well, thanks everyone. Hope you stayed with us. This was a conversation definitely worth having, and I'm sure will lead to further conversations. Again, appreciate your messages. If you share one, we'd love to hear from you. See you later, Dave.
bye.